For most people, it's a simple fact. The COVID-19 pandemic has changed the way we work. For those who work in offices, or did and still sometimes do on certain days of the week, telework has become an everyday routine, from navigating from our kitchens to our laptops to asking our colleagues to please unmute. And things have changed since the pandemic began. Many of us are more willing to ask for what we need, including when we work and where. Quick note, this willingness to assert our needs certainly goes beyond white-collar workers. There are strikes taking place across the nation for worker rights in a variety of spheres. So today's subject matter is certainly part of a larger, crucial conversation. But in this episode, we are focusing on telework. Our work lives have reached a turning point, say experts, and that's impacting everything from how we work to what our workplaces look like to our attitudes toward how we spend those 40-plus hours each week.
Teleworking has caused kind of a revolution for employees, and it's going to be very hard to put the genie back in the bottle.
This is What's Next ATL, the podcast powered by the Atlanta Regional Commission, where we explore the big ideas shaping Metro Atlanta. I'm Kate Sweeney. Today, we talk with someone who spends pretty much all her time learning and advising about our work lives. Elham Shirazi has spent 3+ decades developing telework and flexible schedule programs. She's worked with hundreds of companies, done trainings, and evaluated regional programs all over the country, including here in Georgia. Full disclosure, Elham Shirazi is Georgia Commute Options telework specialist and principal of e-planning. And Georgia Commute Options is housed at ARC, which powers the mic on this podcast. Today, we'll talk with her about her insights on the future of flexible work. So let's get into it. I began by asking Elham Shirazi to bring us up to date in this ever-changing world. Where does office work stand right now?
What the pandemic did is that it really accelerated the rate at which working remotely or teleworking was being adopted. For some, it has meant a model of office first, remote second, which means you come, to the office the majority of the week, but you can work remotely 1 or 2 days. And believe me, that is a revolution for some of these firms because they were very old style. But at the same time, there are a lot of companies that have seen that working a hybrid schedule or teleworking can be very effective. Productivity, in most cases, did not drop, and in some, it improved. So for some firms, it's becoming more of a remote first, office second culture. You can spend, 3 or 4 days remotely and then 1 or 2 days in the office or as needed.
We're seeing now all over the United States what some are calling the great attrition or the great resignation. Quite simply, people leaving their jobs. How does this phenomenon relate, in your viewpoint, to flexible work, to workplace culture, all of the things that we're discussing today?
Sure. I think part of it may just be reaction to the pandemic. But that number of, about 40% of the workforce thinking about changing their job, changing their career, changing their location has been coming up for months. And every month, about 4 million people resign or change jobs. Every month, I've noticed that trend happening. So some of it is also due to realizing that we have families and they matter. We're a very hardworking culture here in the U.S. Everything's based around work, as we know. There is no afternoon siesta or a lot of going out at nights when you're working the next day. So I do think that people have enjoyed this time, despite all its difficulties of being under one roof with your household members and pets and, everything else you're responsible for. People still like it. And it's going to be very hard to put the genie back in the bottle.
It's such a big issue to untangle. And I do think that it's one that many different social scientists will be looking at for years.
Yes.
Like what happened? What happened in 2021? But it's interesting to get this perspective on it.
Yeah, I think the other thing we need to be cognizant of is that All genders kind of equally want access to this, but women are also more stressed out by the pandemic version of teleworking. Of course, that should be no surprise because the division of labor within our domestic lives has not progressed as fast as we like.
That piece of tape makes the final cut, Elham. Thank you for that. You set up a distinction between the pandemic version of telework and a more long-term, feasible system of workplace flexibility. And you note that, by and large, we're not there yet. We haven't yet arrived at that long-term workable setup. So how do we get there?
I really think that we need to take a pause here and think about reasons for which people come into the office. It's not just to meet. There's still a formula where the day in the office is used for collaborating and meetings. We know because of the acceleration of video conferencing, how easy it's become to have meetings. Meetings don't have to be done in person necessarily. People do come into the office for a lot of other reasons. They come to the office to regroup, to enjoy the culture.
Right. And like a day of meetings does not equal rejuvenation.
Yes, exactly. And also build in areas for collaboration and discussions, which are creative. And they're also thinking about, the home is pretty appealing to most people. There are some who hate teleworking, but to most. So if we are going to have an office, make sure that physically that office is inviting and conducive to teamwork.
A lot of office workplaces are also thinking about something called hoteling, in which employees sign in and out of workspaces on the days they come in.
This ratio of 1-to-1, one person to one desk goes away, and space becomes more of a communal area. And you reserve the days that you're either mandated to go in or you want to go in.
Companies that have used hoteling have found that, by and large, people like it, she says. And with the trend of part-time virtual work looking to continue, many organizations are thinking more broadly about their use of physical office space.
Because do we need all this space? We probably don't, but we need communal space. That there's meeting areas, there's private areas. Being together helps culture, but culture again becomes a very conscientious effort.
You talked about the fact that we shouldn't bring people back into the office just for meetings, and that we're learning that we can have meetings from anywhere. But this makes me wonder about Zoom fatigue. I imagine that avoiding that is one reason people want to meet in person in the first place.
Of course. For some organizations, it's been very fascinating because when they would get into meetings, their meetings would go on for 2 hours. And they're so happy that they're not in the office for 2-hour meetings anymore. But then they don't even see how hard an hour-long meeting is. So make meetings shorter. Sometimes a 15-minute huddle is all you need, and cut people off where you have to. Sometimes just doing a 15-minute, 3 days a week will be better.
You heard it here. Tell your coworkers shorter meetings can be more effective. Elham also suggests creating agreed-upon timeframes dedicated to independent project work and other times especially reserved for teams to work together. One thing that I saw in a talk that you did is that you said that teleworking has been found to be harder on introverts. And then I proceeded to get into a debate about this with my introvert husband.
One of the things that we learned a long time ago from teleworking experiments was that people who were not big on socializing, depression became an issue. So we don't want to create a culture where people are just going to work, working at odd hours, and have no reason to go out, even for a day or two. As we know, all this teleworking without pause, people have not been taking vacation or time off because they're like, where am I going to go? Has really resulted in some fatigue just in working. Because every hour is filled up with either work, family responsibilities. You know, some people miss the commute. It's to me, it's hysterical, but they liked the commute as if it were a buffer between home and work.
Right. I saw that in London, a group of academics were urging that people do what they were calling a pretend commute. In the morning, in the evenings, go for a 20-minute walk, around your house, right? And reading that, it just struck me like, oh my gosh, we are in the Wild West
Yes,
in terms of figuring out how
exactly.
work works. Do you see it that way?
Oh, absolutely. And, I also use the Wild, Wild West to refer to all these companies who overnight went into teleworking and this pandemic version of teleworking without the introduction of any guidelines, policies, training skills, expectations, developing goals and objectives to their employees. And so some of those conscious efforts have not happened.
Moving into a workplace that's more flexible, more independent, how does that influence what we look for, both in our employees and in our managers?
I do think that there's going to be more demand for people who are self-starters, people who can work on their own, within some level of mentoring, as opposed to people that we can just direct and say, go, do this many widgets of work a day. And I think the other thing that is necessary, of course, it takes two, is that the manager has to become very goal and objective oriented. And employee evaluation is ongoing. Then there's also training, that you train employees to become more, of a self-starter in a work environment by slowly delegating part of the job to them.
A key pillar of teleworking is trust. Elham Shirazi is not a fan of that software that monitors employees from afar, which she says hurts morale, invades privacy, and amounts to micromanaging. And keeping up morale is important. In an environment that's largely virtual, she says, managers and even CEOs need to communicate quite often with employees, giving feedback and just being their human selves. One thing many people are lacking during the pandemic, she says, is a sense of shared humanity and professional appreciation. You hear talk of telework offering wider potential for us as a society. I'm thinking about the possibility of living or visiting anywhere and having the ability to work for an organization in a particular place without having to go live there. And I'm also thinking about how this impacts, where people choose to live.
I think that this option of work from anywhere is a great option. It's more available to larger companies that have the staff that can deal with tax issues, that can deal with liability issues as people move further and further. And then I've seen slowly this language being introduced in a couple of big organizations that up to a month is allowable from anywhere. This is a very new direction, for this post-industrial world. I think that we're learning that life doesn't have to be work-centric. Work is important. It makes us feel good about what we're accomplishing, but not everything about your identity has to be, about what you're doing during your work. We have other parts that we have let go.
There's no doubt, too, that this sudden explosion of telework has fundamentally changed our commuting patterns. And this is raising questions that regional planners all over the country have only begun to wrestle with. Because where people choose to live and work will impact what kinds of investments are made over the years and decades to come, so that we're truly addressing the challenges before us. Down the road, it's also sure to be the subject of a future episode, so stay tuned. For now, it's just another sign of today's Wild West workplace reality. A final thing that I do want to touch on is something that you brought up in a conversation that we had before this interview that I keep thinking about during this conversation, and that is that we're sort of in an era of empowerment for the employee. Can you talk a little bit about what you meant there and how that relates to these issues we've been talking about?
I think teleworking has caused kind of a revolution for employees in the sense that, they have grown to be more powerful in verbalizing what they want. We heard a lot about people choosing working at home or remotely through employee engagement surveys in the past. Every organization who had those surveys would see a lot of demand. Now what we're seeing happen is that people are vocalizing that. I want to work from home. The other thing that has happened is that managers have been sold on the idea too. And that even goes as high as upper management. I've worked with companies, and we've got case studies where every member of upper management was not convinced about teleworking. Now they're a fan because they got to do it. And they realize they're not going to lose control. They're not going to let the reins go, but it can work. There are some employers, who may want to force a return to the workplace every day, but I don't know how practical that will be. Why not take advantage of what's happened? We used to call teleworking a silent revolution. I think it's well heard.
Elham Shirazi, telework specialist and principal of e-planning with Georgia Commute Options. If you're looking to get your organization up to speed on formalizing its policies and procedures for telework and flex work, Georgia Commute Options offers consulting for that at no cost. Just visit the show notes for this episode on our webpage for more. That's at whatsnextatl.org/podcast. And that's it, our last episode of 2021. As always, thank you for listening. We'll be back in the new year with more on how folks are taking on the issues shaping Metro Atlanta. Please continue to share the show with friends and keep those 5-star ratings and reviews in the Apple Podcast app coming. It does help people to find the show. That's about it for now. See ya. ARC gets support from AARP. AARP is helping to make Georgia an even better place to live, work, and play. They're working with local leaders to help make our cities and towns more livable for people of all ages by advocating for more green spaces, safer streets, and sidewalks. Learn more at aarp.org/GA. ARC also gets support from AT&T. At AT&T, they understand the power of connections. They have proudly been investing in our Georgia communities, making connections for over 140 years. From 2018 to 2020 alone, they invested more than $5.1 billion in their wired and wireless networks, keeping Georgians connected to the people and things that matter most. ARC also gets support from the city of Brookhaven. Brookhaven's successes are continually being honored with awards, including Georgia Municipal Association's Certified City of Ethics and the Georgia Intelligent Transportation Society's Perimeter Traffic Operation Program Award. The work of Brookhaven's Social Justice, Race, and Equity Commission ensures a greater range of diversity, fairness, and inclusion for all residents. Learn more at www.brookhavenga.gov.